Welcome everybody to the Steamship Historical Society of America. My name is Michelle Berard and I represent the development function here. With us today, we have Amy Bakari, our education director, steaming into the future author and creator, as well as our social media coordinator. Amy is going to be interviewing longtime member, a past board president of Steamship Historical Society of America, someone I've been having fun getting to know over the past 9 months, and so honored he could visit the Ship History Center for his first time today, and you're going to learn a lot more about him. And Ted, so let's see, let's a little bit about you. What's your commercial?
What's my commercial?
Yeah.
Well, I took a deep interest in ships as a result of traveling to Nantucket in the summertime. And I was lucky enough to have parents who believe that travel was important. And mother was promised that she would take her two sons. We were 3 years apart. I was the elder of the two, to Europe. And in those days, you almost naturally went by ship rather than by plane. And that opened a whole world of the world beyond my world, which was school, where we went in the summertime and where we lived and maybe where we visited a few friends, to countries that spoke different languages and had all sorts of different customs you had to learn to be polite. You had to learn bits of language so that you could be able to get what you needed and be polite about it. And then I wanted to study abroad and live abroad. And I was able to do a summer course in Switzerland at a city called Neuchâtel. And that gave me an opportunity to travel around Switzerland and see the lake boats and their wonderful railway systems and so on when we didn't have classes. And I went to Paris for a year to grow up because I'd gone to all male schools up until then. I had gone to a mixed kindergarten and pre-kindergarten at a Quaker school when you had boys and girls, but the rest of the schools right up through my fourth year in college were all boys or men. And I found it a hugely interesting experience to have the competition of girls in the class. And it was interesting when I did that course in London at La Sorbonne, the boys a lot of them must have gone to all boys schools too, even though they were Germans or they were, from some other European country, because the girls all sat up front and the boys sat in the back. And the girls were the most anxious to put up their hand and, share the answers. And we were kind of cowed a little bit by them. And that was a big learning experience. And then, I was able to do things on my own once I was salaried and I could choose what I did on my vacations. And that took me to all sorts of wonderful places and sometimes not such wonderful places.
Michelle asked a little bit about your background. I guess throughout your travel, that's sort of how you became interested in ships and ocean liners. I wonder if you can talk a little bit quickly just about how you became involved with our organization.
Well, when I moved to New York, I met some people down at the docks who were looking at ships on weekends when we could do that sort of thing. And in the days when you could pay 50 cents to the Seamen's Charity and you could walk on board any passenger ship in the Port of New York during the embarkation hours when other passengers were going to get aboard. And I began to see some of those same people every Saturday or Sunday over and over again. And then, I always liked to meet new people. So I would walk up and say, you know, ask a question or something like that. And I started to meet them, and then we found out we had common interests. Now, some of them were another organization called World Ship Society, which is an international organization, and then Steamship Historical. And both of them had chapters in New York City, and they had monthly meetings, usually slideshows. And I went to both, and that's how I learned about this one that we're at now, and also the one I belong to in New York. We don't have a chapter of steamship in New York anymore, but we do have a World Ship chapter.
Great.
So some of those people I've known since the 1960s.
Wow. That's impressive. Yeah, I was looking up some information before the interview, and I saw that you did a talk for South Street Seaport Museum at one point in time, and there it mentioned that you had worked in the passenger department for Holland America in the 1960s. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what that was like, and if that was that sort of inspired by your earlier travel, or did that inspire you to travel more?
Well, I think it inspired me to get a job in what was called the steamship industry. It wasn't called the cruise industry, which it is today. And I got the job because my girlfriend had an uncle who had been the head of Holland America Line in North America, and he got me the interview, and I was hired like that. And I started off, and it was actually quite fun. I was on the ground floor at 609 Fifth Avenue, right next to St. Patrick's Church. And KLM, the airline, was in the same ground floor. So when somebody walked in the door, they either wanted KLM or Holland America, and then they would be directed. And we would be in the back of the room. And a game we used to play, there were four of us there, one woman and three men. And we would write down what we thought these passengers were interested in. And you had nothing to go on except, obviously, the way they looked and how they dressed and so on.
Mhm.
And so you would say, you know, the range went from, oh, this is definitely a SS Rotterdam world cruise passenger, around the world in 80 days on the SS Rotterdam in a suite, because she had on a mink stole or whatever like that. And the way she was dressed, she'd just come from Saks, which was only a block and a half away. And she'd probably been to some of the other steamship offices too, because they were all in the same neighborhood. So all the ground floor ones, or, you know, the other end, this is, you could tell this is somebody who's looks like she's European and probably wants to go on the cheapest ship she can get to go back to Holland, let's say. And, you know, then everything in between. And then afterwards we'd share how many we got them.
Did anybody win any prizes, or was there any betting?
Well, I mean, we sort of kept a middle number of who could suss them out the best, but that was kind of fun. And the other thing was fun was that Holland America Line represented all the other Dutch ships in the world that had passenger accommodation, and some of them were freighters, with only 12, which was a typical number. And we had 450 of them, and we had brochures for them all. And so somebody wanted to go to the Dutch West Indies, you know, and they wanted to go on a Dutch ship. We could do that for them because they left from New York, or they left from Brooklyn. And that was really, really fun. It helped you learn geography, and you met all different kinds of people who had different interests in traveling. And a lot of them had connections with Europe, had connections abroad, and great stories and things like that to tell. And then sometimes you had to be careful. You get somebody who'd come in, it was obviously a hot day, and they loved the air-conditioned environment. They thought clerks were cute, and they would sit down and they'd like to talk about their North Atlantic crossings. And then I would sometimes get a little poke in the back or something by the guy sitting behind me, basically saying, your time is up, get rid of that person.
Yeah.
Got some tickets. Then I moved into Pier 40 because they started something called it was promotion. It wasn't public relations, it was promotion. And we had to come up with all sorts of ideas to get people to go on the ships. like tulip time sailings. You know,
Oh,
in
wow.
Holland in the springtime, half the
Mhm.
country is yellow and purple and red with just acres and square kilometers of tulips and things. And so they would be put in the schedule that, you know, the March 30th and the April 7th and the April 14th and so on would be tulip time sailings. They'll get you there while the tulips are still blooming. And of course, you know, women more often than not are the ones who decide where people are going to go.
Mhm.
And we would sell a lot of tickets, you know, as a result of that. And then one of my jobs was we had all these ships. Well, it's very confusing to people because most people don't know about geography very much. And I would become a geography teacher because I was interested in geography. Um, you would put together 2 or 3 different ships, link them together so people could take longer trips. They could go to Europe for a while, they go to South Africa for a while, and then they could go over to Australia for a while and then home if they had all the time in the world and
Wow.
money, and a lot of them, of course, did. And that was fun to put together itineraries like that. It was great fun. But and the other thing was that we were at a pier where the ships came into, and we were the only company where the passenger office, the pier passenger office, was right there with the ships. And
Oh,
so
wow.
my office had a window looking to the north, and if the New Amsterdam or the Rotterdam came in, those were the big ships. I lost my view because they were so long. They blocked my window, and they would be there
Oh,
from
wow.
8 o'clock in the morning, and then they would sail the next day at noon. They didn't come in and out the same day. And if one of the good passenger ships was in, I would go to the company cafeteria. I get my little brown bag of lunch, and I walk on board the ship, and I go up into the first class observation lounge and sit there and pretend I was sailing across the Atlantic, having
Oh,
my
wow.
bacon and cheese sandwich. That
That
was
must have been nice.
it was. And then this will interest some of the younger kids. We once had a Holland South Africa line ship come in to New York, and it was full of circus animals.
Oh,
And
wow.
there were 2 elephants and there were 2 giraffes, and they'd been in the hold for 2 weeks coming up from Cape Town. And then these people from the Bronx Zoo, and everybody's heard of the Bronx Zoo, had to come down and show the longshoremen who were used to, you know, with their hooks getting, you know, big packing crates and things like that. How can you coax a giraffe to walk off the ship?
Oh,
Down
my
the gangplank.
goodness.
You had to make several gangplanks side by side and take off the sort of the fence, the handrails on either side, and you'd go very, very slowly and make sure they didn't panic. And then the elephants, you had to reinforce the gangways and get them off. And then they had the vehicles out front on Pier 40 to take them up to the Bronx. But uh, Zoological Society. That was really fun. Really what I want
Oh,
to do in life.
wow.
Let me keep this as a hobby, and I want to go into teaching,
Yeah.
which is what I did.
Well, that's very interesting. Did you ever stay in touch with anybody that you planned their trips? I wonder, did anybody let you know what their travel was like? Or was it more transactional? You kind of just planned the trips for them and then you never really heard from them again. I just wonder how many people you impacted.
Yeah, occasionally you did. I mean, when I worked, yeah, when I worked at 609 Fifth Avenue, sometimes people would be in the neighborhood and they would come in and ask for me, and they would say that we just had the most wonderful trip on the Maas Dam or the Rhine Dam, or we went, we went on the Holland Africa line, we went to the Royal, we just loved it. And I said, describe a little bit more for me because it will help. And yeah, occasionally they would.
Yeah, that's great. I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about what it was like to sort of see the heyday of ocean liner travel and then sort of how the airline industry came up and what that was like at the time when the airline industry was kind of taking over.
Well, what was like was that you had fewer and fewer choices to cross the Atlantic. Now, sometimes you hear from people, the jets came in the fall of 58, first jets, and that was the end. Well, it happened rather more slowly than that. but where it did really happen was people didn't have to cross the Atlantic in the wintertime
Mm,
by sea. They could fly now. And some people, that's when they had to go. Maybe it was holiday in Europe with their family from Europe. And they had the option, to be able to fly, which you did before, except flying became a lot cheaper with jet air travel
right.
and with the abundance of travel, mass market, and so on. And so I can remember taking, I took transatlantic ships for quite a while after that, and still do as a lecturer. But the summer was still busy for a long time, right up into the middle 70s and late 70s. Until then, the lines had ships that couldn't really be successful as cruise vessels in the cold weather season when you don't want to cross the Atlantic. And they
Right.
weren't very good. They may not had decent air conditioning, and they just had to pack up and go. And so you had fewer and fewer ships to choose from. And then in the end, you basically had two. The Stefan
Wow.
Batory, which was a Polish ship, which I went on, absolutely adored, and the QE2, the Queen Elizabeth II, which
Hmm.
I crossed the Atlantic on probably 60 or 70 times.
Wow.
Some as a travel writer and some as a lecturer. And I loved it. You always knew people when you went on, and they would remember you. And people just loved the ship. The library on that ship was like Grand Central. People just gravitated to it
Hmm.
to look for books and read, but then also probably anybody who was interested in books would come through the library at least once a day, so you could run into people that you knew, and most of whom you liked and wanted to talk to.
Yeah.
That was fun. So it was always available, and that satisfied me. I had my experience on Swedish and Norwegian and Dutch and French and Italian and British. And now, if I wanted to go to sea, it was going to be on a cruise ship, but not one to the Caribbean, mass market one, but one that went somewhere interesting.
Hmm. Very interesting. Can I ask a little bit about your family background? Do you know if your family came to this country on a steamship? Did they immigrate here? Do you know any sort of details about what that was like if they did?
Well, I know about my father's side, and it was definitely before the steamship was
Okay.
invented. It was 1682. They were
Oh, wow.
my father's family were Quakers, and they were persecuted in England and Wales. And sometimes they were killed. They had their land confiscated, and in my family decided, Joshua Scull decided that they should leave and go to America, as other Quakers were doing because of William Penn settling Philadelphia as a place where Quakers could come and be safe. It became Quaker City. And so they came to New Jersey area across from Philadelphia, and then moved into Philadelphia. My mother's side of the family, they were Germans, and they came when a lot of Germans came, and that was in the 1840s. And those generally were people who were fleeing the war in Europe and fleeing the draft, and they were not necessarily poor. And so they would get on ships and come to the United States. So a lot of middle class Germans came to the United States. And at one point, interesting, I understand that Congress actually debated for a while whether German and English were going to be the two official languages in the United States.
Oh,
I
wow.
don't think it lasted very long, but that was the largest population of Europeans at the time. And of course, then later it became, the Irish and and they kept coming, and Italian certainly.
Yeah. So
So
one thing that,
they would have come over in a sailing ship. Sorry, to answer
oh,
the
that's okay.
original
Okay.
question. Yeah.
I think a lot of people, when they think of steamship travel in that time, they kind of have two ideas about what it was like. And I think one is sort of like the really lavish first class accommodations, the really rich travel. And then I think the other representation that people see a lot is immigrants, usually either fleeing Europe, poor people, kind of crowded, and steerage, and how, unfortunate that situation was, really dire circumstances. And I wonder if you can tell us, was there an in between? I think you touched on that a little bit with the Germans coming over, right? They were a middle class people, but what would travel have been like for them?
Well, I think, steerage was really poor, a poor accommodation and very unpleasant, and even more unpleasant if people got seasick, because several people would get seasick and then lots of other people would get seasick. And it was probably pretty awful because the lower parts of the ship were not well ventilated. And it must have been really awful. Now, the journeys themselves became shorter and shorter as steamships got faster and faster. That, a lot of the journeys, let's say from Germany, which was a big exporter of people from Europe, and especially Eastern Europe and Russia, some of those journeys were only 7, 8, 9 days, unlike it had been with the sailing vessels. And so some of it was really bad. Obviously, first class, we've heard all about that. And I think very often the two ends are talked about because that's the sexy part. That's,
right.
that's what people want to hear. They want to hear the worst and they want to hear the best. And in the middle is boring.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that did migrate to the United States who did so out of choice. They weren't necessarily persecuted. They could have been. They weren't necessarily poor, but they could afford more, or relatives had gone before, made a good home for themselves and sent them money so they could come over second class or cabin class and not have to endure that. And so there was that middle part as well. And then steerage classes varied a lot. And one of the most famous lines, Hamburg American Line, had a president named Albert Ballin, who was a son of a Danish family, Danish Jews, who moved to Germany, and he became head of Hamburg American Line, and he built the most powerful steamship company in the world. And a lot of their business was immigrants. And how did he amass that? Because he gave them all sorts of lures to come that made their journey easier. He invented the idea, one ticket will get you from Warsaw to the coal mines of Pennsylvania. And on that ticket will be a railroad ticket from Warsaw to Hamburg. I have built what's the equivalent of one of the largest hotels in Europe, where they can come and stay until the ship is ready to take them to Europe. They will be greeted when they get to Europe, transferred to the railroad station on the other side of the river in New York, and put on a train to the coal mines. It'll all be done for them. And,
Wow.
and it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And he really was hugely successful, and then made other people copy when they could, what he had put together. And that increased the immigration, because people would write back when they got somewhere, and a couple of months later, people would hear, well, it wasn't so bad after all, because we were met at the railway station. We were put on the ship. We were taken off the ship. We were put on the train. We were greeted in the other end because we were employed by a coal mine or a farming, a farming company or something like that. So there were definitely good sides, to it as well.
Yeah, and I'm curious if there's something you think maybe is like the biggest myth about immigration on steamships. Is there something that's, I guess, that most people know that you think is just not 100% accurate? Because what we're trying to do is sort of give a good context, like what a real true representation of it was. And I feel like there is sort of the, focusing on the high class and then focusing on the suffering of the poor. And so I wonder if there's anything else that maybe is a big misconception that people think about.
Well, nobody thinks about the middle. A
Yeah.
lot of people don't think of first class passengers as being immigrants. But
Right.
I mean, you know, there were a lot of good-looking men in the United States. There were a lot of good-looking girls in the United States, and women in the United States. Sorry, and so Europeans wanted to marry them, you know, and they may
Mhm.
have had money, and so you know they migrated across the United States, and vice versa. There were
Yeah.
lots of women who wanted to marry an English lord, and there were lots of English lords who didn't have very much money anymore because they were land poor. They had all this land, but you know they didn't have much money, and so they would lure these American debutantes, you know, et cetera, over to the other side, and you know, so there was all of that going on as well. That's a small percentage, but that's also sort of glamorous and kind of yucky at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, when people think about the push pull factors in immigration, you tend to think about, maybe a push factor is war. And so you think about all these kind of terrible things to leave behind. And then you think about the greatness of America and the draw of sort of economic or religious freedom or prosperity. And I think maybe with the middle class, it's not quite the same narrative. And those factors maybe aren't the same for them.
Well, and it's not as exciting a story. Well, I mean, what one of my favorite things is to collect posters, not just to put on the wall because there's no more wall space, but to have as slides and give talks about them. And they're posters designed by Canadian Pacific Railway that show a handsome young men out in the prairies of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and getting the young women on the other side saying, "Mother, Daddy, you've talked about migrating. Let's go." And that looks like a neat place to go. And that was one of the lures was Canada has these wonderful people that you can meet when you come, and so on. And there's one poster I really like where there's a man all dressed up in a suit. He was obviously British, but he was in a suit, and he was now Canadian. He obviously had done well, or in those days, I suppose even junior clerks wore suits. But anyway, he was greeting his family coming off the steamer, and here he was in this suit and hat and everything like that. And he looked, the height of prosperity. And the shipping lines would have special rates for people like that, because maybe the man was a success. And so we want the rest of the family too, because they will help the country become a success. They had to fill up the land, and
Right.
make it prosperous. So there certainly was that going on.
Very interesting. So I also read about your sort of globe-trotting voyage in 1968 and how you decided to travel the world. I'm sure you have lots of good stories about that. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there was getting a point by 1968 that you were not going to be able to say, I want to go from San Francisco to Yokohama. I want to go from Los Angeles to Sydney by a ship that was going from Los Angeles to Sydney. If you were going to go, you had to fly or wait for a cruise, and you didn't want to take a cruise because you weren't interested in that. And so the point-to-point travel of ships, like a train from A to B, was dying. And I wanted to experience going around the world by sea and connecting by trains in between, where it wasn't the same port, before it was too late. And I just made it. I think
Wow.
probably a year and a half later, some of the legs could be done. Now, I'll just pick a couple that are really fun, and how you really learn to grow up. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So I was just about to start my teaching career, And of course, the kids later years said, "Sir, the best classes you had were those slideshows that you gave when you came back from that trip and other trips." Of course, it was a way not to have to talk about subjects that they weren't particularly interested in. But then, they all sort of say that. But you got good responses from them, and you taught them things and so on, I think. So the first one was that I want to talk about was from Yokohama to Hong Kong, and it had been an American export ship, an U.S. flag passenger freighter that carried about 100. And now it was owned by a Hong Kong Chinese named C.Y. Tung, who now owns one of the biggest shipping companies in the world. He's died, but his son is involved now. And so I went down to the ship because it seemed like neat, take a freighter, and it was going to take 13 days to get to Hong Kong, stop along the way in Japan and Taiwan and so on. So I get on board, I have a nice cabin and everything. And then I go down to dinner, and the dining room has 6 tables, round tables, with a lazy Susan in the center, and all of the places have chopsticks except for one.
Oh, wow.
And I knew when I looked around, I didn't see any other Americans or Brits or what we call sometimes just Europeans. That so that must have been my place. And then I saw the chief steward standing over in the corner, and I said, "Do you think you could give me a pair of chopsticks too?" And he said, "Oh, yes. And he took it away and put it in. So I went and sat down. Well, it was before Chinese food was really popular. I mean, you went to Chinatown, New York once in a while, but it wasn't this glamorous, array of where from different provinces and all that kind of thing. So I'd never used chopsticks before, and I realized that it's some people get it right away. I didn't, and I had my head down like this most of the time, trying to get almost shoveling, food, and you look up and nobody was looking at you, but when your heads were down, that they were all looking at you, and nobody said a word during the entire dinner. Just complete silence. And I left the table hungry. And the chief steward heard my rumbles in my stomach and said, "Come on, I haven't had my dinner either. We'll get a new bowl. We'll stick it in the center, and I'm going to show you how to use chopsticks." And he did. But what's really was fun is that he asked, "Do you play Scrabble?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I don't think any of these other people play Scrabble, but would you play Scrabble with me when we're at sea?" And I said, "Sure, I'd try it." So here I was, playing Scrabble against a man who really played Scrabble, whose English was really good. His vocabulary was even better. And we had to agree on certain slang, British slang, Chinese, American slang, spellings, British spellings, American spellings, and things like that. We had a ball. And what was fun was that the ship had no stabilizer, so it would roll back and forth. And this is before Scrabble, when you had those little niches that you put the letter in. They were all wooden pieces. They weren't plastic. They were wooden pieces. They were very slippery. And he would know when a roll was going to have a little jolt at the end. And if the jolt at the end would shove all the pieces on the floor or make them all scramble. So he would say, if he went up like that, he said, "Now's the time, put your hand on the board and try to save it." And every once in a while, the shakes would be such that pieces would work out from under your fingers and they'd go on the floor. But he would remember where everything was to be put back. And we would so that was just wonderful. I loved it. We just had the best time. Laugh. Then the next one was kind of a solemn thing, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I was on a French ship called the Laos, and this was a company that served French Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. 1968 was the Vietnam War at its peak. My brother was in the Marine Corps in the Vietnam as an officer. And we were going along the coast, and you could see flashes inland from the coast, from the ship. We were buzzed at nighttime, by airplanes, usually friendly ones. We'd be out on the deck, and the planes would come down, they'd turn on their spotlights, and the whole ship would be lit up, and then they would go off again. And when the Tet Offensive broke out, I was really worried about my brother. And so I went up to the radio room and I used my French, and the French radio officer was very polite, and he said, "You can speak English to me," which of course naturally he would have to speak English. And he says, "My wife is Vietnamese too, and I'm worried about is Vietnamese, and I'm worried about her too, like you're worried about your brother." So he said, "Come up anytime you want to." And I really felt good because we were on the boat for about 6 days.
Yeah.
And it was going back to France. And then when we got to Bangkok, there were certain R&R places where my brother could get, a vacation from the war for
Mhm.
5 days. And he knew exactly where I was going to be. And Bangkok was the last one on the list. And it's a long story, and I'm not going to go into it now, but it took us almost 36 hours to realize we were both in the same city at the same time. And a sweeper at American Express opened the door to the American Express office on a Sunday morning and let me look through the mail. And then there I found a little note from my brother where he was staying. And
Wow.
and then we had an extra 4 days because his plane back to Vietnam after his R&R was blown up. And
Oh my goodness.
he got an extra. He came back from the war fine. Now the next one, you stop me when you think we're going to run out of time. The next one was an Indian ship, and that was from Singapore to Madras, which is Chennai now, and it was about 10 days. Very old, very slow, very Indian, and most of the passengers were Tamil-speaking Indians from southern India. There are huge populations of Indians that live in Malaysia and Singapore. And this was the cheapest way for them to get home. And a lot of them, because of where they were working, had appliances and things that were a lot cheaper than in India in those days. And they would want to bring theirs back with them. And they had big, baggage allowances, but they would sleep on the deck. And
Oh,
when you got on board, they had their mats. They're like prayer mats. They weren't all Muslims by any means, but a lot of them were. And they would get on board and they mark their space on the deck by their mat. So that was their place. And there were piles of luggage and their clothes and all that kind of thing. And then they put tarpaulins over the top so to keep the rain off and keep the sun off during the day. And most of the passengers were deck passengers. Europeans were not allowed to travel deck class. And the reason was that accommodation needed to be available to people who couldn't afford anything better.
okay.
And if Europeans couldn't afford it, well, they shouldn't be traveling to begin with then. That was
Right.
so that was, and I shared a cabin with an Indian bookstore owner. He owned a bookstore in India, and he had tons of books he was bringing back to India. He was the most interesting person. We'd go to sleep at night. The deck above was wooden, and there was not air conditioning, so there was a fan that came down, and it sort of whirred during the night, but the cord was frayed, so there were sparks coming out of the cord.
Oh my goodness.
See where the ceiling had been charred over the number of weeks. And he looked at it all very carefully. He said, I don't think that this is going to be a problem, but I'm going to speak to somebody about it. And nothing ever happened because I don't think that they had any wire, but nothing did happen. We had the most marvelous time going to sleep together, just talking to each other, and then we would go to sleep. And that was kind of neat. And then one more.
Yes, one more. This is interesting.
One more was, I think this is probably the most interesting. I was on a British ship called from a company called the British India Steam Navigation Company. They had about 300 different ships over a period of time. And they had routes from India and Pakistan, which of course had been British, to the Seychelles, which had no airport. And I actually went there on one of their ships until the 1970s. And then to East Africa, which was British, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, or Tanganyika then, and then Central and South Africa as well. So they linked all the coastlines. And this ship had started in Bombay and was picking up in Mombasa. And so I got on board, and it was in what was called saloon class, which was the upper class. It was Europeans, mostly Brits, and Indians. And the Europeans were all leaving where they had lived maybe for several generations, the families, because of Africanization. Their jobs had been Africanized. And they were leaving to find some other place to live, whether it was South Africa or Rhodesia or Australia or New Zealand, or go back to Britain. And most of them had never lived in Britain before. Maybe they had family and they went there once, but they had never lived there before. They lived in East Africa. And one of them was Kenya's hangman, who would regale people who would listen until you didn't even want to be in the same room together, of how many people he hung, how many Africans he hung.
Oof.
Because of the Mau Mau insurrections at the time. I mean, people like that. And then there was a very nice Indian family that I became friendly with, because the husband and wife and 2 daughters, and one of the daughters was my age and absolutely beautiful. And they had dance evenings, and there was an open deck, and they had a little band and so on. But I was told by somebody, because they knew I was interested in this woman my age, that you're going to have to ask the mother and father. Okay. So I would go over and I would ask the father and ask the mother, and they would bow and say yes, and then we would dance and so on and so on, and I'd take her back again. And then if it was another dance I wanted to do, I was supposed to do the same thing again, and so on. And we chatted during the day, the family and so on. And the man was really he was really quite interested because he said he'd never met an American before that he had spent so much time with. So my big idea was, and wait to hear the denouement, my big idea was, let's get together after we get off the ship, because they lived in Durban, which is the first port. And we'd get together at a coffee shop or something like that. And the rest of the family wasn't around, because I didn't want to do it in front of them. And he said, I don't think that's a very good idea. And I remember just freezing. And he said, you're a very nice young man. My daughter has thoroughly enjoyed dancing with you and chatting with you as we have, but I don't think that's a good idea. And of course, I hadn't thought about what I was walking into was apartheid.
Yeah.
White people did not mix with Black people. Indians were Black people.
Wow.
And what happened was, when we arrived in Durban, we all walked off the same gangway, having been in the same restaurant, the same dance deck, same deck chair areas and so on. They went through one door to customs, immigration and customs, and I went through another door, immigration, customs, and that was the end.
Wow.
I mean, it gives me chills.
It's so sad. I know. It gave me
chills.
goosebumps.
That because I hadn't thought about any of that. And then, of course, there are all sorts of things that happen when you're there. You just have to be very careful of what you do. And you don't criticize, then you do not criticize the system. That's the way it is. If you don't like it, out. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot then.
Wow. And I'm sure all of those travels really, I mean, I can imagine being one of your students and hearing those stories. I think that would really inspire me to think about geography in a different way.
And what was kind of amazing, I was on 8 ships. One of them was the France, going from Southampton to New York. So there were a lot of Americans on that. There was only one American on all of those 7 ships that was traveling like I did.
Wow.
There were Canadians, there were Germans, there were French, not many French. There were Brits, there were Scandinavians and so on, but there were no Americans doing it at all. No overlanders. And I was really surprised at that.
Yeah, I think that's something, I mean, even still, Europeans travel a lot more than Americans do. And I wonder why that is. Is it the ease of travel because they're closer, or is it just the culture?
Yeah, I think it's, the French didn't travel a lot. After the war, they were not very good travelers. They all wanted to go to the south of France or the Brittany or something like that. But then they started to go to ex-French territories. They go to Martinique, they go to Guadeloupe, they go to Vietnam, after the war, and in places where French language was spoken and so on, because a lot of French people didn't speak English unless they were in the tourist.
Right.
And Germans definitely traveled all over, and Scandinavians traveled all, but then all the Scandinavians could speak English. And if you could speak English, you could go almost anywhere, except
Right.
some countries where in parts of the country where people wouldn't know English. So, and America had so much, variety, I guess, in the country, and everything seemed so far away from everything else. Whereas, as you said, Europe, you're in amongst a whole lot of other cultures. Well, okay, let's find out what the really other cultures are like. So let's go
Yeah.
to the Far East and that kind of thing.
Hmm. So interesting.
Yep.
I saw some photographs you took from your travels. I
Yeah.
wonder if you can just talk a little bit about, you know, like I was interested in seeing the people really on the ships, the passengers, the workers, sort of that's what I like to think about when I think about ships. Coming from a history background, I'm not a super technical person.
Right.
So, um, I guess, did you have in your mind what was really important for you to document, or was it just sort of as you were going, something you would see that was interesting and then you would snap a picture?
I think it was spontaneous. I think the first pictures I ever remember taking on this trip it was January in Japan, and all the
Mm-hmm.
women were using parasols or umbrellas
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
for the snow, and I just thought that was utterly charming.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so much of Japan is utterly charming.
Mm-hmm.
The bartender on the Chinese ship took me ashore in a couple places in Taiwan because that's where he came from. We went to the back streets, and he said, "Do you like to experiment, with food?" And I said, "Mother always said try everything once."
Mm-hmm.
So, I was wide open. And we went, and he could explain things afterwards he didn't like to in the beginning, but he wanted me to try all these things. And then I wanted to take pictures of that and tell people what it was, the horrible looking thing or the
Yeah.
beautiful looking thing or whatever, and try to remember what it tasted like and so on. It was wonderful. So that kind of thing
Mm-hmm.
is really neat to take. And then on the ships was people in deck chairs. I mean, that's, people in their deck chairs, it's almost like the most relaxing thing that you could do.
Yes.
And some people will be chatting away with the people next to them who they've just learned, or have something in common, or they're reading, or one of my favorite things was snoring, where some man would go back every afternoon about the same time of the day after a beer or something, and his mouth would be open and he would be,
Yeah.
and you didn't have the noise, but you had everything else.
Yeah. But from the picture, you can remember the noise, right?
Yeah, you
So,
can. Right.
yeah.
No, yeah, I think, and I find in New York, for instance, I speak about New York on the Queen Mary 2 as well. And one of the things I really like to do is to show them people. And like, all
Mm-hmm.
right, we're going to go to Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn, which is a place where a lot of Italian Americans came. And the Italians are great gardeners. And so the reason why they called it gardens was that it was like a garden. It wasn't a suburb. It was a garden community where they had big gardens in the front, and they could
Mm-hmm.
put out all their Roman Catholic statues and things like that. But then they had wonderful bushes and flowers. And what I wanted to do is to go and chat them up. If I had a friend or a cousin or something from Australia, my wife's Australian, and you chat them up and talk about there, and then you say, can I take a picture of you gardening? And so there's Carroll Gardens with a descendant of an Italian family.
Wow.
Who you have that extra thing. And in Central Park, 2 Saturdays ago, we heard about the outcome of the election, and a group of friends said, we want to go into Central Park. We just felt so good. It was the most beautiful day. It's like today is now. And we went over to the sheep meadow, and the sheep meadow is this huge grassy lawn place. There must have been 2,000 or 3,000 young people sitting
Wow.
on the grass in groups, not drinking a lot. I mean, some of them had food and beer and stuff. They were just wanted to be together to celebrate.
Yeah.
And every once
Oh,
in a while there would be an outburst of applause or something, and then the whole garden, the whole um, sheep meadow would, erupt with cheers and stuff like that, and then it would die out.
Oh, wow.
Come from somewhere else. It was like the coming together of people that have
Yeah.
something in common. And what a
Oh,
wonderful
wow.
place, what a wonderful square, city square, basically, to be able to
Yeah.
do it in.
Yeah. Wow. It sounds like it.
And and then I put those on Facebook, so put some of those pictures on Facebook, and I got more responses to that than almost anything else I ever put up there.
Wow. Well, that sounds great. I would love to see more of your photographs and potentially, I mean, if you would let us maybe to include some of the things we talked about today with some of the photographs of the travels, especially like the Japanese, I can just picture in my mind all the beautiful parasols. I would love to see that.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm not sure how much time you have left. I know you've got a train to catch, so
Well,
you tell me.
we're not leaving here until 4 o'clock.
Okay, so we have a little more time.
Yeah.
Okay. I wondered if you could talk a bit about the books and the travel guides that you've written.
Yeah. It's kind of a potpourri. My first book was on the Staten Island Ferry
Hmm.
because the city wanted a book on the Staten Island Ferry, and nobody had done one since George Hilton, who's probably known here, made a little booklet that I bought for $1 when I moved to New York.
Wow.
And they wanted something more substantial. So they said, we obviously want to approve it, but just we'll give you the go ahead to go on the boats when you want to. We're going to tell the captains and the pilots up in the pilot house that you're coming and so on. And so I went off and did it. What I really wanted to do was not the history of the ferry so much, but how the ferry designs changed and what did all these guys do? It was mostly men in those days. And what did they really do up in that pilot house? And what was going on in the engine room and all this kind of stuff? And then meet some of the passengers. And I remember going up to the pilot house on the first morning, and there was this a lot of Staten Islanders are Sicilian. So they say, I'm Sicilian, I'm not Italian, I'm a Sicilian.
Yes.
I found out, make sure you get the right term to use. And this captain, Vincent Pizzo, he looked at me and he said, you're writing a book on the Staten Island Ferry. This is the most boring job in the world. And of course, I'd never met any of these guys before. There was a whole culture, obviously, in that pilot house. Others, deckhands, were there because they heard this guy was going to come and write a book about us. He wanted the audience, and so on, so he could entertain them while scaring the hell out of me.
Yeah.
But what came was he was my star in the book.
Wow.
He had this. One of his best things was, the ferry has to dock in a slip, and the slips on Staten Island and at Lower Manhattan, their currents are going by the mouth of the slip. So you have to aim, just right, know when to cut the engine and so on, so the boat doesn't hit up against a rack and knock 500 people down and all this kind of stuff. So he had this Mickey Mouse hat, and it was right on the deck, just next to the wheel. Well, now he wasn't at the wheel. Yeah, he usually was at the wheel. And if there was, I was up there a couple of times, but there was a bump. Okay, a little bit, and the men were always anxious to get on the subway, fast. And so they were all way out front, and you could look down, and you had probably 10 feet of deck that had 50 or 60 people waiting for the gates to go up so they could rush for their subway. And they all turn around, if he hit really hard. He put on this Mickey Mouse hat. The window would be open. He would say, what do you want? A real captain for 25 cents?
Oh, that's good.
It was just brilliant. It was just brilliant.
That
So
is so
I had a great
funny.
time with that. And it came out, and it was really, the rush hour and the tourists on board, and the woman who said, I only come to Manhattan once a year, and I go to Macy's, and then I go straight home.
Oh, wow.
It's the island mentality, there.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
the people that were dressed up, on a Saturday night to go into the city. I mean, Staten
Hmm.
Island's part of New York City, but no, you're going into the city when you go to Manhattan, and they're all dressed up and stuff like that. Oh, just all the different kinds of things that happen. I did a book on the Lackawanna Terminal in Hoboken, which is a wonderful old railroad station, which has ferry service, and it's all still there. And then I guess the ones I enjoyed the most as useful was a series called Carefree Getaway Guide, Day and Weekend Outings Without a Car. All right.
Oh.
Half the people in New York City do not own a car.
Hmm.
Okay. I sold my last car. Are you ready for this? In
Yes.
August 1963.
Wow.
And I moved to Paris, where I learned, well, I couldn't afford a car anyway. You don't
Right.
need a car when you live in Paris. You've got the subway and
Hmm.
the buses and all this kind of stuff. And then I came back to New York, worked for Holland America Line in New York. I'm not gonna pay for a garage for a car. I'm certainly not gonna move my car every other day from the
Yeah.
street either. You don't need one. And then I went to London, and same thing. I was a student, didn't have the money, and wasn't even interested. They have a wonderful transportation system.
Right.
And so I just got used to being without a car. And I didn't ever live in the suburbs again, where I grew up.
Hmm.
And I moved to New York permanently in 1968. Don't miss it for a second, owning a car. If we need a car, we rent one,
Right.
which is a few, Anyway, so what I did was I wanted to open places for people to go and show them how easy it is to go without a car. And you have huge student populations in New York. You
Hmm.
have people just starting out working in New York who don't own a car and probably can't afford one. And they want to do things. They want to go out to the country. They want to find a neat park in another borough. They want to find restaurants, museums, hikes, all these kinds of things. And so I built a book where nothing would be a destination unless you could get there comfortably by bus or train or boat. And it was a great success. And it got 2 or 3 publications. And then I changed it slightly when another publisher came along, and it went on for about maybe 20 years. And then the publisher said, we want you to have the what's the thing what's the thing that people use to find their way around when they're out in the woods or something? What's it called?
Like a GPS
Yeah,
or.
GPS thing. Yeah, right.
Hmm.
And so I was going to have to go out and do all these trips over again with a GPS, which I
Wow.
didn't understand because I couldn't even remember what didn't want to do to begin with. And I said, I said to them, when we're doing a hike in the woods, the trails will all have blazes. So people
Right.
follow the blazes. If they're going to do walk on the old Croton Aqueduct Trailway, which is a 30-mile on top of the old Croton Aqueduct, linear state park, they can't get lost. They stay on top.
Yeah.
you know, uh, and they're in some small town. Well, turn left on Mount Vernon Street and then turn right on Washington Street.
Yeah. People are addicted to GPS nowadays, though.
And I didn't want to be a part of that, so I just
Yeah.
decided I'm not gonna do it anymore. So
Yeah.
hump to them. Then I did a book on all the boat trips you can take up and down the East Coast. They're not necessarily cruises, all the little ferry trips you can take and excursion boats and things like that,
Hmm.
which was really fun to do because I had to do them all. And that was a success. And then then I did 100 best cruise vacations. So I would pick a mass market cruise, which were what were the best ships to go on if you don't have a lot of money and you want to go on the big ships in mass market. What do you want if you want to go on a fancy ship? Which one is the best? Which ones are the best? If you want to go on really small ships that take you up rivers and to Antarctica and the Arctic and things like that, all that. And so that was fun to do for a while. And then I just didn't like revising it. It was just boring. So I
Yeah.
decided I'll do something else. And then I decided I'm going to my memoirs, the aspect of my memoirs are all going to be on my sea travels. And I'm going to write some books about like the round the world trip I made, trips I made on by ships, not cruise ships, ships to different parts of the world, and tell the story of what was that really like and how different things were that you could actually get on a ship that had national flag crew members, and
Yeah.
not this mishmash of international people, which is great for jobs. But
Right.
I mean, one of the reasons why the French line went out of business, they couldn't afford the French wages anymore.
Yeah.
So they sell it to Norway. Norway decides to make it an international ship. They can have everybody in the world. And I remember going on the Norway for the first time. Everybody was so excited to see the Norway because the France had been such an exciting ship. And the captain says, and we have 44 nationalities on this ship.
Wow.
So, all right, it's got lovely funnels. It's big. It was the latest thing in 1961. But what's the atmosphere like if you got all? It's a UN. Well, I live in a UN in New York.
Right. Yeah.
And what's neat was you could go on a French ship where it was France afloat. That's why you went on the French ship. Everybody spoke
Right.
French in the crew. And they didn't
Yeah.
necessarily come from France. They came from French Polynesia or French Guiana, other places, but they spoke French. It was a French culture. Italian ships were definitely very, very cultural. You really knew you were on an Italian ship. There was a whole
Mhm.
joy of being Italian. Waiters would burst into song once in a while, things
Oh,
like that, and just they were there to give you a bedtime, a good
right.
time, the way
Right.
you do when you go to Italy. And that all that kind of stuff basically has just disappeared.
Were you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Amy, I don't know if you know this. So we at the board meeting, Simone Joyeux, she was
Uh-huh.
a little spiel with the board, and she's like, the France, that's the thing, right? And Andy Coggins is like, yeah, he has a model behind him. And
Yeah.
she's talking about as she was a child because her father was French from France, and how they would travel abroad on the France. But it was
Oh,
kind of funny. I'm like, well, you got to up your game, Sinan, a little bit.
yeah.
I
That
mean,
is too funny.
the French line to me was the biggest loss of any of the
Yeah.
steamship lines across the night when they went out of business and the crew mutinied off Le Havre because they heard the French government was going to remove the France because they had arguments in the two houses in two political houses in France. We don't want to subsidize Americans anymore
Oh,
by keeping the France alive, and it was more Americans that took it than French because the French
right.
were traveling, and so it just there was a mutiny, and that was it. It's over. It was taken out, and
Yeah.
now it's gone. And that I was on the France a couple of times. My first ship I ever went on was the French line. The second one was the French line. I went to Corsica on a French ship. My brother
Oh,
and I did
wow.
it. I went from Marseille to Mallorca on a French ship. There was something about them that were just wonderful. And the French line, and then the Messagerie Maritime, the one along the Vietnam coast. There's something about the hospitality
Yeah.
and the food, the whole atmosphere of the whole thing.
Yeah, I bet. Well, thank you so much for answering these questions for me. I want to make sure you have time to kind of get downstairs and look at what we have in the archives and
Yep.
really get to know the Ship History Center. But I really appreciate this. I had a nice time chatting with you.
Great. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you so much.